This episode is sponsored by Krim. Krim skillfully designs and manufactures professional coffee equipment like their Onyx manual espresso machines, Coffee Queen filter brewers, and Unity, their fully automatic coffee makers. These sleek, versatile, and reliable machines come with proactive service plans to ensure a differentiated and seamless coffee experience for coffee professionals and enthusiasts. Find out more at krim.coffee. You're listening to the Coffee Podcast. This is the Coffee Science Series, Ag R&D. Vern Long is the CEO at World Coffee Research, an organization known for their research and agricultural work with coffee varieties and genetic resources. Vern has 25 plus years in global agricultural research and joins us to introduce the topic. Ag Science and Research, or as we will call it throughout the series, Ag R&D, because that's what the cool kids do. She has called coffee, quote, a plant breeder's dream, end quote. But what does she mean when she said this?
The role of the plant breeder is to pick up where farmers have left off. So for thousands of years, farmers have been selecting the best seeds in their gardens, in their farms, and have planted those seeds and have done a great service to humanity, having selected the crops that are now the standards on our breakfast and dinner tables. And what a plant breeder does is we work with the diversity that's out there. So the varieties or land races of crops that farmers have generated over the millennia, we start from that material and we try to find the material or the plant that's really drought resistant and take the pollen and cross it just like a bee would do to create some new plant that both has the right color kernel so that it's going to make the perfect tortilla chip, but then is also drought resistant. So that's what plant breeders do, is that we really rely on the diversity in the natural world to do our jobs. In coffee, there are over 120 species of coffee. So that's not even talking about the variability within Robusta or within Arabica, but there's like Stenophila and Liberica. There are many different species of coffee. And from a plant breeder's perspective, that gives you many more. Think about it like paints on a palette. You have all these different colors you can work with as opposed to just a couple. And that's what makes coffee so exciting, is so much of that has been untapped by the breeding community, and it creates potential experiences for consumers. But as importantly, is potential economic opportunity for farmers who might find those new varieties. And I think that when we face the fact of the climate crisis that is upon us, we need every color on our palette, every tool in our toolbox that we can come up with to help our shared heritage as humans on this planet. We need every tool at the ready. And the beauty about coffee is that it has such tremendous diversity across all the species of coffee. Although, we have talked about the limitations of Arabica diversity as a challenge for climate change. But I think that as a plant breeder, we just see opportunity and we try to make the most of what we've got. And I think that's coming from other crops. This is something that's unique and special about coffee, is its tremendous diversity of species, which will be new for consumers over the next 50 to 100 years as we look into this.
I want to go back and just clarify something. You mentioned there's something like 120 other species. Is that saying like not including Robusta or Robusta, however we want to say that, and Arabica, that's like 118? You get what I'm saying? Just to clarify. Okay.
That's right.
So we're working with two of essentially something around 120.
That's right.
Is what I'm understanding there. Okay. I feel like that's an important thing to pause on and just go, okay, whoa. Whoa.
Yeah. And it's not, and it doesn't just stop there. So like within Robusta, there are many materials within them. So if you think about walking into the grocery store and you see all the different apple varieties in the grocery store, a pretty common sight in a lot of American supermarkets. There are many different varieties. Well, those are all one species of apple. So that would be the same as having a bunch of different Cabernet Sauvignons or the wine grapes that create the different wines. They're all grapes, but they're different varieties. Well, when we talk about coffee varieties at WCR, we just work within Robusta and Arabica at this time. So we're looking at the varieties within those two species. But in coffee, there are many other species that are related to coffee Arabica and coffee Robusta, but have unknown sensory characteristics. And so, as a plant breeder, we would generally work within a specific species. So you either a grape breeder and you're trying to make wines, you're not going into some other types of species of grapes. In coffee, it's something that we can look at because of the genetics. And it's something that a few people are actually already looking at. And I think it'll be an exciting area for coffee breeders going forward.
How is coffee different from other crops from an agricultural research perspective?
That's a great question. And I think that there are two parts to this. So the first part is that when it comes to agricultural research, there's the science and then there's who does the science and then there's who pays for the science. And I think that those are the parts of this story that are really important to break down and understand. When it comes to coffee, there's a lot that we can take from other crops to bring to coffee. And when we talk about precision of terms, I'll talk about that a bit more deeply, if you want to dive into this. So when we think about what we can do in coffee to improve our research activities, get there faster, better, cheaper, as much as we can to bring technologies and new varieties of coffee to farmers to solve their immediate and pressing challenges. There's a lot from other crops we can take. So I think in terms of the science, there's a lot that we can learn from other crops and use. But when it comes to the differences, I think one of the primary differences has to do with the time horizon. So for coffee versus annual crops, there's a big difference. The cycle of time it takes to generate a new cherry on a coffee tree is a few years. You don't get it the next season. Whereas in annual crops like corn or wheat or soybeans, within one season you get seed. So that's a big difference when you think about what kinds of research questions you want to embark on. So the kinds of questions you ask in coffee, you have to be really thoughtful. Like if it's going to take you 12 years to get the answer, you have to ask research questions that are worth waiting 12 years to get an answer. So you have to prioritize very differently in coffee as a tree crop than you would in other crops. And so I think time horizons are really important to think about for any tree crop, but coffee no differently from that. But I think the other question then comes down to resources. And when we think about who's paying for coffee research, it's predominantly coffee producing countries. There are some countries with substantial resources focused on coffee, like Brazil and Colombia, have significant research budgets to support coffee science. But then there are also many coffee producing countries that don't have very robust research portfolios and resources available. And I think that's one of the distinctions. So it's not just the science of what makes coffee different from other crops, but it's also how it's paid for and what resources are available for its research.
How is coffee different from other crops from a socioeconomic perspective?
That I think is like the logical sort of segue when we think about whose resources and what resources are being brought to bear on research questions for coffee. I think we need to think about what's relevant for coffee producers. And so when we think about the socioeconomic dimension of coffee as a commodity, researchers need to think about the context of the grower. So in highly mechanized, highly efficient technified systems like in Brazil, the kinds of innovations that you will generate will be responsive to that farmer. So you're going to have mechanized trees that work well in a mechanized production system. If you're working with farmers who are on the side of a very steep slope, options for mechanization are different. It's not that they can't be had. I'm sure there's a robot that can be developed if you had infinite resources. But the question is, what's relevant? Like, what's a relevant technology given the socioeconomic context in which we're operating, not just with respect to developing the technology that works for farmers in these different environments, but also what is affordable for farmers. And so thinking about those technologies that really work for farmers who are at different stages economically, both themselves and sort of all the farmers in a country. So when we think about who's doing research in a country for farmers, it really makes sense that you're thinking about the relevance and the need for technologies that work for those farmers in that context and making sure they're relevant. So I think with coffee, the socioeconomic dimensions are really critical to think through, precisely because it's a perennial crop. People plant this tree in their farms and it's there for years. And so you really have to think about the kinds of questions that make sense to answer to improve things for that farmer in the time horizons of what research can deliver. So socioeconomic considerations really matter a lot when both prioritizing the research and also thinking through the kinds of technology you will develop given the socioeconomic realities of farmers.
Interesting. Yeah. So identifying that relevancy for, per region or per farm, et cetera, is a really critical piece of this sort of pipeline of research getting to the producer.
Absolutely.
Why do precise words matter in our conversation? And some examples would include, like, I hear smallholder farmer, but it's never defined, or the word altitude being described when describing coffee growing conditions, et cetera. There are these kinds of words. Can you identify a few for us, clarify, and then explain the value of using precision when we speak?
Absolutely. And for those who've been working with me, they've certainly recognized my attention to this issue. When we think about trying to describe a problem we're trying to solve. So for a farmer who is really concerned about the slope of their field, if they have a really steep slope, they're probably worried a lot about erosion. So with rain, the rain comes down, the water washes away the soil on their farm, and that's really a big problem for that farmer. And so when you're using words to try to describe the problem you're trying to solve, it's important to be precise, because not only to make sure that we're all on the same page about exactly what we're trying to solve. So making sure that when scientists are talking to farmers and really understanding the issue at hand, that the question is clearly articulated. I think in coffee in particular, there are needs to engage really broadly with a number of scientists from outside the coffee science world. And this isn't just in the crop space, but I mean like climate scientists and modelers, economists, soil scientists. I mean, there already are robust collaborations with people from many different fields who are working with coffee. But I think that the precision comes in because when you're trying to explain your challenge to a diverse group of scientists, you've really got to be precise to make sure everybody understands the words you're using. And so when you talk about altitude, like the height off the ground, that's different from elevation, which is how high the mountain is. And so when you talk to a climate scientist or a soil scientist, the distinction between altitude and elevation matters tremendously because you're measuring different things with very different units of measure. So I think that those are the kinds of precision issues that really come up when you start working with scientists from other fields who've never worked in coffee. And to really take advantage of their expertise and skills and knowledge, we need to find that common language. It's something we obviously struggle with as scientists talking to the public. Like, we often use words that don't mean anything to the public, and we need to use words that are more clear. And that same thing goes for working between scientific disciplines. They have their own jargon and their own language. But when it comes to certain technical terms, precision matters. I think on this question of targeting research to really focus on relevant stuff. Like, we don't need answers to questions that aren't a problem. We need answers to questions that are a real problem. And so when we talk about the term like smallholder farmer, that really needs to be clearly defined. Is it somebody who has 120 trees? Or is it someone who has less than 5 hectares? Or is it somebody who has less than 20 hectares? And in different countries, each of those is characterized as a smallholder farmer. But a person with 120 trees has very different technical considerations compared with somebody with 15 hectares, just because of the labor requirements and the use of family labor versus, the need for hired labor. Somebody with 120 trees is probably not hiring labor, but somebody with 10 hectares probably is. And so that has consequences for the kind of technology you develop. So I think precision in terminology is important because it helps us make sure we're all focused on the same challenge, to make sure we really understand the problem we're trying to solve, and that we can make sure that when we talk with people from different disciplines, we're able to take advantage of their expertise. And I think this is something in particular when biophysical scientists who are really interested in leaves and pathogens and soil samples talk to social scientists and economists and start talking about the bigger picture of coffee as it sits within sort of the social and economic domains. That precision of language is actually really important.
I'm going to step towards a quote from Harvesting Prosperity, which is a work that you actually pointed me to. And in the work, it said, quote, 2/3 of the global extreme poor earn their livelihood in farming, and productivity growth in agriculture has the largest impact of any sector on poverty reduction. That's the end of the quote. So you iterated this to me, but with the qualification that productivity is not the only thing. What did you mean when you said that? And what does that mean for our conversation?
When we think about coffee as, it's at the center of all of our worlds, whether you're a barista or whether you're a trader or whether you're a researcher in coffee, coffee is the commodity that unites us and excites us. It's part of a broader economic picture for origin and producing countries. So when we think about what coffee farmers need, it goes back to this question of who's a smallholder, how we define poverty, how we define relevance of technologies for those farmers, and understanding that when we embark on a scientific endeavor to improve coffee productivity, and the reason productivity has been the focus in all of that has been because productivity is a really critical driver of economic growth. And, from the quote in Harvesting Prosperity, which really digs into this question, it definitely differentiates between a cash crop like coffee and food security crops, where the pathway is a bit different. The thing that unites both contexts is productivity. You really want to get more output for all the work you put into it. And if you can get twice as much coffee for the same amount of effort, that's a pretty great deal. And what we're talking about here in terms of the broader economy. So if you think about it, if a farmer in Uganda has double the amount of production on their farm. They didn't change the number of trees. Each tree yields more coffee than before because you've added fertilizer, you have a really high quality variety that's really producing a high volume of coffee. So you're increasing the amount of offtake from that farm. That means that you don't just need one truck driver to come pick up your coffee, you need two. So that's now two jobs that have been created, right? There was the one person who came, and now you need a second person. And then you need two people to offload that coffee because you need one person for each truck. So all of a sudden you went from having two jobs to four jobs, right? And so the sort of multiplicative effect of improving productivity, there's a very concrete way in which it can grow jobs out through the supply chain. So if you're at the port loading coffee onto ships, your job is there are two times as many people required if the total volume of production has been doubled. And so when we think about coffee as part of an economic considerations, that's where this whole work of Harvesting Prosperity is looking at how we can really think about different commodities and the agricultural economy and how it basically transforms low-income countries to middle-income countries, that pathway out of poverty. The other point to make on this issue really goes back to this question of precision. When we talk about a smallholder, poor farmer in East Africa, that's a really, really different lived experience from a farmer in Guatemala or a farmer in Honduras. The economic realities of those farmers are dramatically different. When we think about the technology agenda to help farmers in their own context, we want to make sure that it's really relevant for the farmer based on where they are. And, when we think about agricultural innovation and how we can help farmers and how we can use agricultural R&D as a driver of poverty reduction, but it's a driver of poverty reduction at scale for a whole country. But it's also materially different for an individual farmer because that farmer will produce twice as much coffee, which means their return, they get double the money. Now, of course, the cost of production is also higher when you have more, but the idea is to improve the productivity so that the total output relative to your input is growing. It comes back to the importance of precision on who we're talking about, but also the opportunities and technology need to be tailored to those farmers based on the economy that they're in.
I'm going to step out on a limb here. The question that comes to mind is a question of supply and demand. And I know coffee has, historically had some really huge things happen around the frost in Brazil many years ago. The thing for coffee seems to be that supply and demand really do crazy things to the C price. My curiosity around increasing production is what impact would that have on supply and demand?
Absolutely. And I think it is the question that many, many people ask and is the focus of a tremendous amount of thoughtful consideration. At the end of the day, the reason why productivity is so important in agriculture and for agriculture to be a driver of poverty reduction is that in a low-income environment, for low-income countries, and so by that I'm referring to the World Bank classifications, increasing the amount of output for an individual farmer, let's just say if they spend $5 to run their farm, this is just an example, but they make $10 in returns. They use $5, they get $5 profit. If they could double that, and so they actually were able to sell $20 worth of coffee so that their return is higher. The bottom line is that productivity is the pathway for an individual farmer to increase their revenue. It's a response at the individual level. So productivity helps an individual increase the amount of output per input. When you go to scale, the question is can like to your point on global market level, can the total volume of production that is now produced, if every single farmer doubled their production, what would that mean for global prices? And I think that is why agricultural R&D is one tool that needs to be used in concert with other types of tools. So policy tools where you have price floors for farmers and you have safety nets for farmers, because boom and bust is the world of agriculture. And yet, despite that reality, globally, agricultural R&D has remained a core investment, a core tool for improving productivity and helping contribute to reducing risk, because if farmers are more productive, they can sell their coffee or they can sell their other commodity, but there has to be tools that are beyond just that production level investment, like agricultural R&D, to smooth out that risk for farmers. So in some countries, they, in a commodity, they might store it, right? I mean, there's classic examples of, you store for 2 years and then price. So depending on storability and the conditions of storage, that can also smooth the market. So we can't think of ag R&D as a single tool in the entire toolbox of ways of reducing poverty. And I think that it's really important to understand the distinctions between different kinds of coffee farmers and their needs, and where a productivity enhancement is the kind of tool that improves their profitability versus other kinds of tools that make sense. And so there's a great book called Factfulness, which offers really helpful ways of understanding these kinds of trends. And one of the things he describes in the book, Hans Rosling, is that he says, if you're on the 50th story of a really tall building and you look down, all the buildings below you just all seem short. And I think that sometimes when we're here in the US or North America, we see poverty as this sort of monolithic, singular phenomenon. But when you're on the ground, you absolutely notice the difference between a single-story building and a 10-story building. There's a really big material difference between those two. But when you're really far up above, you can't necessarily distinguish those really important and meaningful distinctions. So when we talk about poverty in coffee production, the realities of what is going to help poor coffee farmers make more money and get a better return on their investment absolutely matters what country they're in what context. Are they a 1-floor building or are they a 10-floor building? Because the kind of response you'll have is really different. For a 1-floor building, so where productivity is going to be a real driver of opportunity, if you double production for a farmer in Uganda, that has a significant and material effect on their income for the year. It has huge potential transformative opportunity. If you increase production in Guatemala by only 1 bag, the marginal effect for that farmer is much lower. Relative to Ugandan farmer, they have more assets. They're like the 10-story building. So I think that thinking these things through helps us be more precise and focus the investment and the conversation in the right places and the right tools to be brought to bear.
I noticed as well you reference ag R&D. Is that the fancy way of talking about agricultural science?
Yes, agricultural research and development. Okay. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that.
Perfect. I just want to make sure I'm catching up on the lingo. So, what does the pipeline of coffee science innovation look like for ag R&D? Like, we say things like from seed to cup, but in this, I'm actually thinking that totally flipped around. And this time, something more like from the research lab to the seed.
This is where it gets really exciting. When we think about the opportunities in coffee science, and particularly agricultural research in coffee, we start at both ends, both the cup and the seed and the farmer who's thinking about the seed. And this is an approach that many call demand-led research. And the idea here is that you start with clarifying the problem, using precise language to articulate the terms, what are we trying to solve? And so when we think about agricultural research for coffee and what WCR and other organizations are doing, you start with your consumer and you try to understand what it is that they want. They want a coffee that has particular flavors or experiences that they want to get out of their coffee. And then roasters have particular goals that they have. They want the coffee to roast in a particular way and to have a particular flavor and to blend in particular ways. And then you talk to farmers and they know exactly what they want. They want varieties that perform well with the kind of production system they have. So all these different stakeholders in the coffee supply chain are having demands. They all have demands. They all need certain things from this coffee plant. Mm-hmm. And what's really exciting about coffee breeding and plant breeding, which is, back to the beginning of our conversation, why plant breeding is so exciting, is that you can solve for all these people's priorities at once. And so you identify what are the most important features of this plant. So sometimes farmers want a short tree, sometimes they want a tall tree, sometimes they want a bushy tree, sometimes they want a tree that prunes well in a particular way. And all of those different features of the plant can also be associated with different kinds of cupping quality. And so essentially you identify all these priorities. And when you're developing the research, the first thing you do is you really need to clarify the problem you're trying to solve. So you identify each of these stakeholders' priorities. And then the process for coffee breeding is going to the trees, so going back to that diversity that exists and seeing whether the trees have these different traits. And so you cup coffee from different trees, and then you look at the habit of the tree. Is it really bushy? Is it not really bushy? Is it tall? Is it short? Whatever the characteristics are that this farmer is really motivated to see in the final variety. And then you get to play the pollinator. So you bring the pollen from one tree that may have just the right bushiness, and you bring it to another tree that tastes great. And then you create the seeds that then you plant, and then you basically keep selecting. And so these steps of understanding what the demand is and understanding how you can bring all those different priorities together in one technology. And by technology, we mean a variety of a tree, just like your Macintosh apple or your Gala apple. Some apples are great with cheese. Some apples are really not. So some apples are better in a pie. And it's the same way for coffee, understanding how these different traits come together and ensuring that we can develop varieties that really respond to all of these priorities. And then ensuring that we test the varieties in farmers' fields to get real information back from the farmers of what's working and what's not working.
So outside of the pipeline, there's a conversation, I think it's assumed probably for most people, that coffee science isn't cheap. So how do we measure the added cost for the producer? And also, why is coffee science so expensive?
Science in general has actually gotten to be quite expensive. In the last 40 years, the cost of doing science has just increased. It's from the cost of the energy required to run laboratories, the cost of land, the cost of labor to manage large tracts of land with many, many trees. As a tree crop, that just expands your cost and your footprint immediately, because to plant a lot of trees or to keep them in small plantlets and greenhouses all takes a lot of energy and a lot of irrigation and capital equipment. So it's just an expensive exercise doing research. It goes back to this question of who pays for the research, and that's really an important consideration. Many countries have export taxes. So when coffee is exported from a country, a levy or assessed tax is assessed. That revenue then goes back and supports coffee research in the origin. And so in many ways, producers are already supporting the research that supports their industry. But as we said, the amount of resources that are available in lower income coffee origin countries is not as much. And so the available resources to pay the big bill of managing research using the tools of the 21st century, it's a pretty tall price. And I think that's why when we think about how we can democratize access, we really want to be very intentional. What do we really need to do? What do coffee scientists need to harness? And that's what we really think is important, is prioritizing and ensuring that we're focused on a really relevant question that matters a lot to farmers, and ensuring that every dollar is spent in the most efficient and strategic way, just because coffee and science is just an expensive enterprise.
Yeah, and I was just wondering about this. I don't know how far this thought can go. I'm a little curious about, for producers in different countries, this is going to depend, I guess, on where they are, but they're taxed. And that tax goes into something like research, science research. And I would understand that would end up getting built into the price of coffee when a roaster purchases it or what have you. But I hear there's a lot in the industry about people or groups buying green coffee, sort of going back to the producer and saying, hey, but can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this kind of thing? Maybe this isn't a question, just an observation. I've noticed that there's this emphasis on research that benefits primarily what seems to be the roaster. Like the weight of risk seems to fall on the producer. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. I'm kind of developing this thought as I'm talking. I don't know. What do you think?
Agriculture is a boom and bust industry, and farmers have for many, many millennia been at the riskiest end of the food supply. Yeah. Farmers face tremendous risk. Climate risk, market risk. There are a lot of risks associated with farming. And it's for that reason, high-income countries have huge systems to manage and mitigate that risk. There's insurance that's, underwritten by the government. There's research to increase stability of performance of a crop over time, precisely because it's very risky for farmers to have a bad year and a good year. The volatility is just a feature of agriculture, and it's not unique to coffee. Farmers in any commodity will tell you boom and bust is the deal. But that is exactly why coffee farmers and farmers of any crop really benefit from having research investments that increase the stability of their performance. And so, there's nothing worse than having a huge swarm of locusts descend on your plantation and all of a sudden eat all the leaves. Like, it's just devastating, absolutely devastating. And yet, that's exactly the kind of risks that farmers every year are facing. In Central America, when the leaf rust hit, it was devastating when all those trees got defoliated, because that just meant all the leaves fell off, which means there was going to be no yield. There was nothing to feed the cherries, And so that is exactly the kind of risk. But that's exactly why innovation is really important. And it's why farmers, as there was a famous farmer from Nebraska, actually, who stood up on the U.S. Congress floor and said, there are three things that I need. I need sun, I need rain, and I need research. Because, that farmer can't control the locusts. They can't control the rust, but they can support research to develop innovations that reduce their risk. So fungicide that you can apply to a tree successfully to save the tree, right? So the fungicide costs something, but at least it's a solution to your crisis. And so the more we can ensure relevant innovations that are affordable, and I think that gets to the heart of your question, which is, this tremendous inequity between the kinds of risks that farmers face in coffee, which is an industry, there's tremendous value added in coffee, but there's this asymmetry in resources. And so the more that we can ensure that the tools are made available to farmers to reduce their risk, the more we as a community can come together and level that risk out and just mitigate that risk. And, research is only one tool. Like, insurance has a huge part to play, renovation programs that are often government funded or, sponsored or subsidized. There are many different tools. R&D isn't the only one, but it is a critical one for managing risk. And I think when it comes back to it, your fundamental question, which is, well, how do we make sure that farmers get the right kinds of technology? Relevance is key. Making sure that we focus on the most important priorities for farmers based on their reality, their context, and making sure it's accessible to them.
In the same vein, if the majority of coffee farmers are poor, how can they, especially smallholders as they come up, though I haven't defined them technically, how do they afford endorsing these innovations that they need to be profitable?
At this time, most coffee research is undertaken by national coffee institutes in coffee producing countries. And so in that way, coffee farmers are engaged actively in developing that agenda. Farmers associations are a really important nexus organization to advocate for technologies and innovations that really focus on their problems. And so I think it's just a question of representation and engagement. And so in some countries, there's really robust connectivity between the farmers associations and the farmers themselves and setting that research agenda. And in other countries, it's really not that well organized. And so again, I think the specifics of each country really matter. But I think one thing that's a really important tool for farmers and farming communities is to be able to see what's available in other places. And I think that just digital tools and the web have been a tremendous resource for many, many farmers who are looking for information and looking for what's out there. It helps them access more information. I mean, even some really remote farmers in places you wouldn't imagine had cell phones have cell phones and can access data. So the world is changing fast. And I think that that's something to watch for sure.
Could you plug Brazil's coffee technology innovation solutions directly into Rwanda?
So it's a great question because it gets to this concept of what economists call spillovers. So you basically have research in one country that's really great, and then it can move around the world. And that's what catalyzed the Green Revolution, was taking varieties that did really well in one area of the world and moving them to another area of the world and creating tremendous value for farmers and for whole societies. And food security was addressed in that way. When we talk about some technologies in coffee, there are some innovations that can be transferred. So the basic innovation of pruning shears. You can have a pruning shears produced in China or produced in Brazil and be useful anywhere in the world. The question is, how you prune the tree. In East Africa, there's a very different pruning approach from the way it's done in Central America. And so when you're talking about the variety or the tree itself is probably not going to work. But we don't know. And actually, that's been the subject of a lot of interesting research that a number of folks have done together is to figure out what are the kinds of innovations where you can transfer from one country to another and get a big leap, and make leaps and bounds. So the technology leaps, and then the local farmers get leaps and bounds out of it, and others they don't. This is exactly what we need to figure out. One thing that's come to the attention of the world's breeding community and other crops is there was historically, the last 40 years, in many crops, people thought you could do a lot of breeding at a global level, that you could create new varieties of things at a global level. And it's kind of been realized over the last 10, 15 years that when you actually look at the data, crop breeding, so new varieties of crops, really just are developed at a regional or a local level, at a national level. And so when we think about that for coffee, it really kind of resets our understanding of what makes sense to focus on. So when we think about, there may be some solutions in Brazil that absolutely could be tried in Rwanda, and it may be things like soil conservation or innovations around management or pruning that could be tried in a new production system. And it's always worth trying things that farmers have a look and see if it might work. But at the same time, we realize that a lot of research in coffee in particular, but in plant breeding globally in many, many crops, has been understood to be something that's far more regional and far more national than we used to talk about. So I think that that's sort of reinforcing the need for a sufficient level of capacity at a national level to focus on the research questions specific to that country, because there are nuances and specifics that matter a lot. Trees that are pruned in one way are, certain types of varieties are going to do well in East Africa because of the norms of how people prune, versus in Central America where that variety would fail because it would drive everyone crazy. So you absolutely have to get the right technology in the right spot.
Well, it sounds like national associations would play a major role in this sort of oversight. You can't have one organization trying to solve all these very specific problems with relevancy changing from region to region. And we've talked a little bit about how the government plays a role, in some cases collecting a tax that goes right back into coffee research, which hopefully is extended to the producer and benefits them. And what is the role of governments in the process of accelerating the progress for producers, in your opinion?
I see the role of government depending on the way the research infrastructure is constructed. In East Africa, the national government research organizations, like the equivalent of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but in each of the East African countries, those are national research institutes that are part of the government's broader research enterprise. And I think that what it's really critical for governments to do is to really look at how they can bring the capacities and knowledge from other researchers across their institutes into coffee where it makes sense. So in some countries, like in Uganda or Ethiopia, where coffee exports represent a significant percentage of revenue for the country. So they export the coffee, and then the government, the actual amount of foreign exchange that's earned from the sale of coffee, in Ethiopia could be $500 million, and it could be a substantial chunk of resources. The consequence is that the kind of innovation that's happening really needs to be tailored to help the country continue to export successfully. And so there's a high level of motivation on the part of the government to ensure that the research is adequately resourced to keep that circumstance moving, so that the ability to continue exports is really critical. I think the role of governments has to do with ensuring that the research is relevant and to engage the farmer community, and to ensure that there's accountability in the orientation of funds, making sure that resources are targeted on the right things. But it's also much bigger than just the research piece. It's the broader enabling environment, like the policies that make things work for people, like you were talking about earlier. If there's a boom and bust cycle, if there's tremendous volumes of production and the price goes through the floor, it's devastating for families. It can be tremendously disruptive to the community. And that's exactly why governments who are highly motivated to increase production at the national level also need to be thinking about those policies that protect people, the safety nets, to make sure that if someone doesn't have a good year, that there are tools in place to cash transfer programs or different kinds of insurance products that farmers can access that ensure that they're around for next year's harvest. And so that the broader economy can benefit from the opportunity to export coffee, but that farmers aren't bearing that whole risk on their own as individuals. And so I think that those functions are really important beyond just the R&D agenda.
Yeah, thank you. And I know it's not like the most invigorating conversation for people, across coffee, but this is a really important point, I think, is the connection between not just coffee research to the producer, but like the players in between as well. things like governments, associations. It's not a sexy conversation, but it's critical, wouldn't you say, for the infrastructure of how, just talking about accelerating the progress for producers?
Absolutely. I think that all of us have learned from this experience with COVID in the US and the challenges that our communities have faced, that having friends and a network is tremendously valuable. And it's so important
Mm-hmm.
to have community and collaboration. And I think that it's no different for farmers, coffee farmers around the world, is that working together and collaborating it's hard work, but it's what's needed to keep all of us safe and healthy, right? And I think that that's the
Mm-hmm.
same
Yeah.
message, no matter the community. Working together is critical to get
Yeah.
through hard times.
Now is kind of your turn to offer resources. What kind of resources should our listeners pick up? What else do you have for us?
If you just want to keep a routine beat to what's going on, we have active social media feeds at WCR that you can connect to really know what's going on in the broader community. We amplify other communities' research, not just our own. So we really want to be a resource for folks to stay tuned in to the latest and greatest in the ag R&D space for coffee. But we also, there's just a couple of tools that are pretty great and super accessible. So, one is just Google Scholar Alert. You can actually set up a Google Scholar Alert with just put in your search terms. If you're interested in quality coffee or any other theme, you can just put it in there and you'll get an email once a week or once every few weeks when recent papers have come out in that topic. And so you don't even have to be actively searching. You can let Google Scholar do the work. So those are just kind of some quick and easy access points. We also know that a lot of national coffee institutes, especially if you speak Spanish, they have their own local coffee platforms, and you can follow them on social media. So you can access a lot of real-time stories of what's going on at Origin just by joining their feeds and seeing what's going on. So I highly recommend that. One other book, just on a personal recommendation, Beyond Factfulness, which I think is just a great resource to just understanding the world. I made my kids read it, and they're 10 years old, but it's a totally accessible book because it's really fun. I mean, the book just really takes these abstract ideas about, what is poverty and what is, what's the world all about, and just breaks it down to really practical questions or ways of answering things. But the other book that I thought was kind of an interesting one, we actually just recently had a webinar by Stuart McCook on his book on leaf rust.
Oh.
That's another great resource. I got it and read it, and it's a very accessible a story really about sort of combining the history, and talks about the history of research and also the importance of it and how it's evolved over the last couple hundred years. So I would definitely give a shout out for that, just because I thought it was an interesting read and really helps make something really accessible and interesting for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Stuart McCook was on the show not too long ago promoting his book. And for our listeners who haven't picked up the book yet, it's definitely time to pick up the book. So,
agreed.
Okay. So, what are you working on, and how can our listeners be a part of that?
We've just launched our strategy. We are starting a new set of programs over the coming couple of years, and we'll be providing that information out to the community. But I think that sort of in terms of a broad message or a takeaway from this talk, and I know that sometimes I can speak in really abstract ways, so I too need to work on my precision and accessibility so that everyone can understand what I'm talking about. Although I'm super excited to have infused ag R&D into your lingo. We really see that agricultural research and development is a foundational part of a sustainability agenda. Like, if we really want to have long-term economic, social, and environmental sustainability in coffee supply chains, there's no way to get there if you don't include agricultural research and development. It's been the case in every other crop. It's going to be the same for coffee. We really need to focus on it and again, pick the right things. Like, that prioritization, super important. It's just as important for the quality of coffee. So recognizing that the broader sustainability of the sector, but also the goals of coffee quality improvement and consistency, coffee ag R&D is a big part of that. And the other kind of fun thing, especially when you think about the time horizons, like in Stuart McCook's book, and thinking about the history of coffee, the coffee we drink today is a result of research and development that happened over the last 100 years. And so the coffee we drink in 10 years is going to be the result of the research we do today. And so, if we really want to make sure that we have this fabulous drink that's a huge part of our culture and our life and our livelihoods and the livelihoods of many, many millions of farmers, R&D now is what's going to be driving that in the future. So it's kind of neat to think that we're drinking from the past, but we're creating the future. So
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
Is that what you would like your main takeaway to be, or do you have something you want the listeners to take away from this conversation that sticks out to you?
I think it really comes down to really enhancing our conversation around this idea of precision and really being specific about what we're trying to achieve. There are many goals and they're all laudable, the environmental goals, the social sustainability goals, and the economic sustainability. And I think the more we can be really clear in what our goals are and recognizing the world is a wonderfully diverse place, kind of going back to my original take as a, 10, 15-year-old kid driving across America and seeing the diversity of this amazing country with the landscapes and the agricultural systems and the communities, and recognizing that as we think about the global challenges, when we start to tackle things, it's really helpful to break it down into smaller pieces and to be really precise and to focus on those elements. Because I think the broad brushstrokes of trying to solve big problems but not getting precise prevents you from really finding the solutions that actually drive progress.
Our next few episodes will dive deeper into a topic within coffee ag R&D, specifically the seed sector. Just how important is the research behind that little guy you plant in the ground? Find out in our next episodes within the Coffee Science series. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, and until next time, happy brewing.